Well, good morning, everyone. It is good to see everyone today. So let me think. We've taken our son Macon to the Wednesday night. We have a Bible study every week, right? And we've been having a K through 5 class. We have some wonderful volunteers doing that. And Macon has been hanging out in there, but since he's a little bit young, Jen has a tendency to hang around and make sure he's doing okay. But now that he started school, attitudes and things are changing, so not always for the better. And so the other Wednesday, Jen brought him in. She hung around like she usually does, and all of a sudden, Macon looks up, looks right at Jen and says, "Mom, what are you still doing here?" It was at that moment we realized we now have a teenager in the house. I feel like those attitudes are starting to change a little bit. Would you agree, hon? Yeah, okay. What are you doing here? So we started a series a few weeks ago on struggle. And we're implying that struggle is a part of life. It comes all over the place. It comes in many, many times in our lives. And because life can feel like such a struggle, the Bible needs to speak to that struggle. And we've talked about different aspects of it, looked at some different Bible stories. Week 1, we suggested that our struggles are really spiritual at their heart. Even when they look like the things going on in our life, deep down, our enemy is not those things, but it's really this spiritual world around us. And because that battle has already been won by Christ, we can withstand all that happens here and now. In week 2, we talked about how struggle is an opportunity to learn, and we looked at the life of Job, and we looked at some of the things that he learned from his life about stretching faith and all of this. And then last week, we talked about our struggle as being something that's often on behalf of the church. We looked at the Apostle Paul and how in his life he talked about struggling in prayer or struggling in the things that he went through on behalf of the church as he'd been called to do so. And we too struggle and become the best kind of church when we struggle on behalf of others. And today, I want to kind of finish up this series looking at one more person in the Bible who I think exhibits or demonstrates this idea of struggle about as well as anyone. And the person I'm thinking of is named Jacob. And Jacob is a guy who just from the beginning, from the time he was born, he had to struggle and fight for respect. He had to struggle and fight with others to get anything in life. He had this sort of combative nature, and you can see it from the very beginning. And I want to kind of look and break some of his story down. It's a long story, so we're going to try and just hit a few highlights. But let's go ahead and just start with his birth. Here's someone who had to struggle and fight just to survive his whole life. If you've got your Bibles and want to follow along, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 25 to begin. I want to look at the life of Jacob, and this is the story of his birth. And it's kind of fascinating because even before he's born, he's already struggling and battling his brother, literally. This is how the story goes. Verse 21. Isaac, that is Jacob's father, prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah, that would be Jacob's mom, became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her. What do you think? What's another word for jostled? Wrestled, struggled, fought. In other words, in her womb, these two brothers are battling. And I do not know what it feels like, but I imagine a wrestling match going on inside of you is uncomfortable. I mean, can anyone confirm that? I haven't done the research. But I imagine it's kind of tricky. And so she responds, as you might think, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And so when she goes to inquire of God, she finds out, okay, there are actually two children inside of you. It's Jacob, and anyone remember his brother's name? Esau. And Jacob and Esau are literally wrestling inside of her, jostling for position. Even before he's born, Jacob is at odds. And that's wild to think about. And with this, she's also told that each of them will birth their own nations, which is part of the theme of the book of Genesis, where we kind of find how each of these important births given by God have consequences for a lot of history. But nonetheless, it raises how important what's going on inside her is. Now let's jump down to verse 24. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. This is not an attractive sounding baby. I'm sorry, it's just not. And so they named him Esau, which, by the way, means hairy. I don't know what kind of name that is for a baby, but that is what they named him. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, and he was named Jacob. Now, here's what's really interesting, right? So one, why does it give us this little detail that Jacob is literally grasping his brother's heel? Well, one, it continues the theme of them wrestling within the womb. It's like literally they're wrestling for who's going to be the oldest. And apparently Esau won, and Jacob, from this point forward, has to fight for any recognition in his life. Because he's not going to be firstborn, which in those days had huge stakes to it. And he's lost this wrestling match in the womb, and he will continue to fight from that moment forward. There's another reason, though, why it gives us that detail. Because in Hebrew, as with every language, we have idioms, we have sayings, we have phrases that we use to designate certain things. And in Hebrew, one of the idioms of this time, best we can understand, appears to be something like, he grasps the heel of, which is a way of saying he's sneaky, he's a deceiver, he kind of tricks people. He does whatever he can to fight tooth and nail against every person using his brains to get ahead. And for that reason, Jacob is appropriately named, right? His name means grasps the heel of. In other words, you could have named him deceiver, trickster, fighter, struggler with people. And in the Hebrew, these names throughout the Old Testament have great meaning. And Jacob, from the time he's born, is appropriately named. He's a struggler to simply survive. And then we get more and more into his story, and it doesn't exactly get easier. Every moment he has to fight and struggle for his respect. His brother Esau, it turns out, is, stronger, hairier, more of a hunter type. In fact, this is recorded just a little bit after this. If you go down to verse 27, we find out a little bit more, right? It says, the boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, that's their dad, who had a taste for wild game, loved, and who does it say? His dad loved Esau, and what does it say about him? But Rebekah, his mom, loved Jacob. You know how it's not a good idea to play favorites with your children? Do you know where that idea came from? Well, probably common sense, but if you read the Bible, you see this happen a lot. And in this case, you want to pit these two brothers against each other, pick favorites. They were wrestling in the womb before they were ever born, and now they grow up to be wildly different people. One is a hunter and a man of the open country, and he's sort of hairy and red, and you can picture him. And the other one likes to stay around the house and be around his mom and, take care of things. And on top of that, guess which one is Daddy's favorite? Not Jacob, we'll put it that way. So you get the image, right? You get this picture. This guy's going to have to struggle for every bit of respect he gets. Well, let's fast forward a few years now in the story. Okay, now Isaac is getting older. That's their dad. And he is getting to be blind. He cannot see very well. And there's an important tradition that comes up in the Hebrew culture where before his death, the dad has to give a blessing upon his kids. And the blessing to the firstborn is significant. And the firstborn is, of course, Esau. And there's nothing Jacob can do about that. Unless there is. And in this case, Jacob's name, his struggle with people starts to come true. Now, the way it all plays out is Isaac, being nearly blind, calls in his son Esau and says, okay, I want to do this tradition of giving you the blessing, which came with sort of a prophetic element, a judgment element, and sort of a laying out and passing down of God's promise, as we find with Abraham, Isaac, and so forth on down the line. So it's a very important moment. He says, I want you to go out, I want you to cook some food for me, and when you come back, I'll give you the blessing. And there's nothing Jacob can do about it except that they come up with a plan. Let's go to Genesis chapter 27 now. And let's read what's here. Okay. We'll start with the way the plan was supposed to go. When Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak that he could no longer see. I'm sorry, but apparently this is something that happens with age. I'm worried about that. He called for Esau, his older son, and said to him, "My son." "Here I am," he answered. And Isaac said, "I am now an old man, and I don't know the day of my death. Now then, get your equipment, your quiver and bow, and go out to the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare for me the kind of tasty food I like, and bring it to me to eat, so I may give you my blessing before I die." And there's this deeply respectful moment. And Esau's like, of course, I'll go out, I'll hunt, I'll bring it back, all this going on. And then Jacob, and maybe more specifically his mother, develop a plan. And it hinges on this detail of Isaac being nearly blind. Because Rebekah comes to Jacob with this idea to steal a blessing. And I know this sounds strange to modern ears, but just remember how important this is in the story. This is the passing down of God's promises through the patriarchs. And they are looking to jump up ahead of the firstborn in receiving those promises. So what they decide to do is that Rebekah, the mom, is going to cook some food out of the herd that they already have and make it up the way that Isaac likes it. And then they're going to put their clothes, or they're going to put Esau's clothes on Jacob. Now, I don't know if you can picture this, but I'm just guessing. I don't know this, but maybe Esau's clothes didn't quite fit Jacob. Maybe Jacob was a little smaller. Maybe he was wearing clothes that hung down here like a dress. And it doesn't suit Jacob, but they're trying to pull a ruse here, right? And then on top of that, remember that detail about what was all over Esau when he was born? He was what? Hairy. Well, they've got to figure that one out too. So she goes, and I know it's a deeply respectful moment, but I feel like the Bible is intending to be sort of humorous here. They go out and they get some goat skins and place it on Jacob's arms. And he's walking around wearing his brother's oversized clothes and goat skins on his arms, and I have to wonder just how hairy that man was. And you can see that they're trying to pull this elaborate ruse. And so Jacob goes up to his father, Isaac, who's nearly blind, and here's your food, father, just like you asked. And he's like, wow, you got back quickly. Yes, I had great luck in my hunting. And Isaac's a little skeptical. He's like, well, your arms, they feel like Esau's, but your voice sounds like Jacob's. And they have this back and forth, and the thing that finally fools him is the smell of Esau's clothes. And finally, Isaac gives in, and he gives the blessing to Jacob. Jacob, this man who had to fight for everything he got in life, who was combative, who could not get above his brother, even though apparently his brother was not the best. And here he is pulling this deception through his mom. Now, I'm going to just ask you, but what do you think Esau thought about this particular ruse? He wasn't happy. And when brothers are unhappy with each other, it gets kind of serious, right? It can. And in this case, Esau is ready to hold a major, major grudge. Jumping down to verse 41, it said very plainly here, Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. And he said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near, then I will, and what's that word? Kill my brother Jacob. Jacob has stepped over the line now. At this point, their relationship appears to be beyond reconciliation. Esau is essentially saying to himself that he will kill his brother once his father is out of the picture. And this is not a good thing. And so Jacob and Rebekah make a plan, and he has to run away. He has to flee like a fugitive and run off to his uncle Laban. And if you think that Jacob the fighter finally sort of calms down and everything goes smooth out there with his uncle Laban, you'd be wrong. Because Jacob is born a fighter and a struggler and everything. And so he goes to his uncle Laban, and all these crazy things happen, and we don't have time to read all of it, but it's kind of wild. For instance, Jacob in this season gets married. And there's this conversation going on about Laban's two daughters. If you jump down to chapter 29 and verse 16, we'll read just a little bit of this and summarize some of it. Chapter 29 and verse 16 goes like this. Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Poor Leah. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. And Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, I'll work for you 7 years in return for your daughter Rachel. In other words, there's two daughters. The older one is Leah. The younger one is Rachel. Jacob wants to marry Rachel. Now, talk about tricking and deceiving running in the family. Remember, it was his mom that came up with a plan to steal the blessing. And now watch what his uncle does. After working 7 years to marry Rachel, his I guess now father-in-law, throws a party for the wedding, hosts the wedding like was done in those days. And there's not a whole lot of detail here, but apparently things got a little, they may have drank a little too much. We don't really know exactly what happens, but the way the story is told, Laban switches out his daughters. Like they go into the tent, and Laban sends the other daughter in there. And I love the way the story is told. This is almost humorous. Like, you cannot make this stuff up. It's in the Bible, okay? But go down to verse 25. They go through the entire night. Verse 25, when morning came, there was Leah. What kind of a story is that? There was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you, what's that word? Deceived me. Laban replied, it is not our custom to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. And Jacob, the deceiver, gets deceived. Now, there's at least two incidents of Jacob butting heads with different people in life. He butts heads with his brother and to some degree his father. He butts heads with Laban here. And things don't exactly get better. God continues to bless Jacob. Don't get me wrong. Jacob is the son of promise. It's already been prophesied that the younger brother would rule over the older one. But things continue to get strange. Jacob has to work hard and do special things to build his flocks while taking care of Laban's. And they sort of go back and forth, and Laban doesn't always treat him right. And in fact, at one point, Jacob just runs away. Laban catches up to him, and they're still not getting along because they have this huge back and forth. And there's this moment in which Jacob finally tells Laban all the things that he's done to mistreat him. Going down to, chapter 31 and verse 38. Listen to this summary of his time out there with his uncle. 31 and 38. This is Jacob giving Laban basically a piece of his mind. I have been with you for 20 years now. Wow, 20 years he spent with his uncle. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flocks. I did not bring you animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself, and you demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime and the cold at night, and sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for 20 years I was in your household. I worked for you 14 years for your 2 daughters, 7 for each. For your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. You can see that Jacob is still not getting along easily in life. He's still a fighter. He's still struggling. And he's still butting heads with Laban. And he tried to run away from Laban the same way he ran away from his brother. But in that moment, they kind of hash things out. They get to a sort of better place. And all of a sudden, all of his struggles, it seems like, okay, maybe things are getting better. But remember, there's one part of Jacob that still hasn't caught up to him. You remember what his brother vowed, right? That he would kill him. And at this point, Jacob is heading back toward his homeland, and he's likely to run into his brother Esau. And he still has in the back of his mind one more battle. He's a fighter. And it's funny because, sure enough, he sends out some servants ahead to maybe find his brother and prepare his brother for this moment, that maybe they can make some peace out of it. And the servants come back, and you should hear this part. 32 and verse 6. This is the report that Jacob gets. 32 verse 6. When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, "We went to your brother Esau, and now he is coming to meet you." Okay, that sounds good. And 400 men are with him. That does not sound good, right? You don't bring 400 men just to say hello. And Jacob understands the seriousness of this situation. And so he's got his brother along with 400 men coming to see him right as he's just now come back. He's got this last battle. He doesn't know what to do, but because he's a schemer, because he's a deceiver, because he can use his mind to try to fight and struggle for every bit of respect he's ever gotten, whether working or his family or anything else, he makes sort of this plan, and he sends all these gifts ahead to try to appease his brother. And there's like this whole line of gifts and flocks and herds and money and all coming to try to appease his brother. And each of them are to say, "We are giving you these things on behalf of your servant Jacob, who loves you very much and really hopes you'll forgive him." And then he takes his camp and what's left of it, and he divides them in two, because, I'm sorry, but this is warfare tactical method. If the army comes and destroys one, at least he'll have the other camp. And then he does maybe the craziest thing yet, if you've read his life. He prays. He's not been that much of a praying kind of guy up until this point. And then finally, when all is said and done, he sits down at the edge of a riverbank to contemplate the next day. The sun is going down, and to picture what's going to happen this next day will either make him or break him. And that's when something incredible happens. Down to chapter 32, verse 24, if you're following along. And this is, even in the Hebrew, exactly as mysterious as it sounds. So Jacob was left alone, sitting on that riverbank as the sun was going down. And a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Wrestled, struggled, jostled. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. And then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." It's like his entire instinct is to fight, and the moment he gets touched, he just goes right into fighting mode just for survival. Maybe he thought it was his brother, or maybe he just didn't know anything else to do but to turn around and start fighting, because it's the way he survived every moment of his life. He fights. It's like when Jen and I went on our first date and she tried to hug me from behind, and I turned around and threw her like a wrestler, you know. Okay, that didn't happen, but it could have. It could have. Just in his instinct, he just breaks out into this fight, and he's grasping on to this mysterious man who we find out is actually more than a man, just demanding a blessing. It's like the thing he's fought all of his life is just coming to a head in this singular moment, and he's just holding on for dear life. Verse 28, then the man said, verse 27, the man asked him, "What is your name?" It's interesting that we ask him his name, right? Jacob, the one who grasps the heel of, the deceiver, the wrestler, the fighter, the guy who had to scrap and claw for every bit of respect he ever had. Jacob. And then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." All of a sudden, Jacob's fight changes. He spent his whole life fighting people, fighting his brother, fighting his dad, fighting his uncle, fighting everyone and everything that tried to take anything from him that he thought was owed to him. And all of a sudden now, he realizes the one thing he's actually fighting is greater than anything he's ever known, because he's not fighting human beings, he's not fighting for respect or survival, he's fighting God. And he realizes that, and later he names the place because he doesn't believe that he wrestled with God himself and lived to tell the tale. And it's this beautiful and amazing and mysterious moment in which Jacob realizes he's been fighting God this whole time. Because when you fight with people, you're really fighting with the God who made you. When you fight for respect, you're really fighting with the God who made you beautifully and wonderfully made. When you wrestle against opponents, when you fight dog eat dog to get everything you deserve, the one you're really fighting is God. And the only way to survive that battle is to finally submit. A lot of people fight God. And some of them continue fighting him to the very end of their life. But Jacob, at this point, it's like this change happens. Because at this point, he realizes he fought God and lived. He names the place. He builds an altar. He goes on and finds out his brother already forgave him. God had already made the way. And the only thing he was fighting this whole time in all of his journeys, running away from home, running away from Laban, now trying to divide his camp and fight his brother one last time, he was actually fighting God. And God was waiting for him to say, okay, enough. That's when the moment that he really becomes the son of promise, the inheritor of the promise given to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. In that moment, the story turns because Jacob finally gave in. The name Israel. Remember, he blesses him with the name Israel. And there's a lot of debate scholastically as to what that name means. Israel, of course, being the name of the nation of Israel, the people of God, the ones that God worked through. And a lot of people say it means he who wrestles with God because it came out of this story. And it works in with the language, but it's not overly clear. And there are a lot of people who suggest other things. But what is absolutely clear is that there is a parallel between Jacob's fighting of people and his fighting of God. And that makes him a prince, an in-between God and people, who wrestles both and ultimately comes out okay. One God can use. There's something mysterious about it, but I find it so strange that the people of God, of all the names you could have given to them, has something to do with those who are willing to wrestle the God of the universe and struggle with him. That to be a part of the nation or the people of God is to go back and forth with Almighty God. That shouldn't be allowed. You ought to be struck dead with lightning, right? And yet God allows it because he wants that relationship. Sometimes we make relationships sound like, I don't know, we use a lot of effeminate metaphors. And I mean, it's a lot of romanticism, our relationship with God, but it's at least fair to suggest that some relationships are different. And God's okay if your relationship with him starts as a struggle and ends by giving in. Some of us have been fighting with him our whole lives. And it's finally time to say, okay, and submit, and be renamed, and be brought into Israel, the people of God. A few weeks ago, I mentioned that we were going to kind of change up the way we do some things. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to offer more opportunities for people to respond to the gospel. And so we are going to do an invitation once a series, and today is that day for us. And so I want to take a moment. In a minute, the band's going to come up, and they're going to play some music. What is going on? Okay. Anyway, sorry. That distracted me. I never get distracted on stage, but that one distracted me. We're going to play a song, and I'm going to give you a minute. And I'm going to be up here. We have elders and others around. And if you just want to come forward to pray, to finally submit to God, to talk about baptism or getting involved on a deeper level, I want to encourage you to take this moment to respond. Maybe God's been chasing you for a long time, and it's finally time to submit. But I want to give you that opportunity. And so I think the band is probably about ready to come out. We've got one song to play. I'll be up here. And before they begin, let me at least open with a word of prayer. God in heaven, I thank you so much that we have this opportunity to respond to you. We believe that it's important to say yes to you, God. We believe it's important at some time to stop running and submit. That when we are fighting for everything in this world, in reality, we're often fighting against you. And when we submit, we find out that you have already laid these things out. God, teach us to be part of your people. Teach us to stop running. Teach us, Lord, to know that your hand is upon our life every step of the way, even when it seems like we have to struggle. God, I thank you for loving us, and I pray that you work in the hearts and minds of people today through your Holy Spirit, that whether they come forward or pray in their seats, that they will respond to you entirely and that you would be glorified. Thank you for loving us. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.